The object they handed me wasn't even wrapped. A single button, antique brass, the kind my grandmother kept in a blue tin by her work table. Hundreds of them, sorted by size and finish, a habit she'd had since before I was born. My father slid it across the conference table with 2 fingers, the way you'd push spare change toward a tip jar. My mother watched with the particular smile she reserved for moments she considered as already settled. "She would have wanted you to have something personal," my mother said. "You always loved her little things." My sister sat across from me, a folder of documents already spread open in front of her, already scanning. She didn't look up. My father delivered the rest plainly, the way he announced things he'd considered finalized long ago. The business, the property, the licensing accounts, the registered name. All of it transferring to my sister. She had the background for it. She understood commerce. "You're the scholar in this family, Arden," my father said, and the word came out like a careful edgy for something he'd never actually done. "This has never been your world." My grandmother's attorney sat at the head of the table. He was a quiet man named Mr. Dunmore, white-haired, with reading glasses he held but never actually put on. He hadn't spoken since we'd sat down. He hadn't opened his briefcase. His stillness had a texture to it, deliberate, patient. On the table in front of him was a manila envelope, sealed with red wax, my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized before I was fully conscious of recognizing it. My grandmother's. I didn't reach for it, not yet. I pressed one hand flat on the table, felt the brass button cool under my palm, and kept my face still. I didn't learn what it felt like to be invisible in a single moment. It happened the way water cuts stone, slowly, in increments, until one day you look down and realize the ground has changed shape underneath you. I was 10 when I understood the arrangement. My sister was 13 and had just been accepted into a regional youth design competition, a real one, with judges and a cash prize and a small write-up in the local paper. My mother spent that evening calling relatives. My father ordered dinner from my sister's favorite restaurant. The table was lit up that night, loud with congratulations, with projections of what this meant for her future. I had won something that week, too. A certificate from the County Historical Society for a research project I'd done on local mill records, tracing 3 generations of ownership through handwritten ledgers. My teacher had helped me submit it. The society sent a letter with a small blue ribbon tucked inside. I set it on the kitchen counter when I got home. By the time the dinner plates were cleared, it had been moved to the recycling pile. I don't think anyone did it deliberately. That was the part that took the longest to understand. It wasn't deliberate. It was just that my accomplishments occupied a different category in that house, one that didn't require celebrating. My grandmother noticed, though. She always noticed. Her name was Rowena, and she ran a small textile design company from a converted carriage house behind her property, a space she'd built over 30 years into something I can only describe as organized wonder. Bolts of fabric stacked in color-coded rows. Pattern books she'd hand-drawn herself, each page dated and signed in the corner. A drafting table by the north window where the light was best. A blue tin of buttons on the shelf above it. She was the one who called me that Friday evening, the night of my sister's celebration dinner. She said she'd been going through some old mill records and needed a second opinion. She knew I'd be interested. When I arrived, she had a pot of tea on and a stack of ledgers from the 1890s laid out under her work lamp. We didn't talk about the dinner. We talked about the ledgers. She asked me what I noticed about the handwriting shifts in the margins, whether I thought the entries were made contemporaneously or filled in later. She listened to my answers the way adults almost never listen to children, as if the answer genuinely mattered to whatever she was trying to figure out. "You have an eye for what's underneath," she said at some point, not looking up from the page. "Most people read the surface. You read the structure." I didn't know enough at 10 to understand what she was giving me. But I kept it anyway, the way you keep something valuable before you know its use. She gave me a lot of things like that over the years. Not objects, mostly, though she did give me one. A silver thimble, small and plain, with a tiny dent on one side from years of use. She pressed it into my palm one afternoon when I was in high school, said it had been her mother's, said she wanted me to have it before, and then she stopped, corrected herself, said she just wanted me to have it. I wore it on a chain for a while. Later I kept it in the front pocket of my work bag. I'm a document archivist by trade, specializing in estate collections and rare textile records. A career path that surprised my parents when I chose it, and surprised them less over time when they realized it was quiet, unobtrusive, and unlikely to generate the kind of visibility they associated with success. What they didn't understand, because I never explained it, was that the work had made me genuinely good at something specific, reading what documents say and what they're hiding. The night before the estate meeting, I hadn't slept well. Not from grief, exactly. My grandmother had been ill for over a year, and her death, when it came, had been anticipated, even peaceful. I didn't sleep well because of something she'd said to me 3 weeks before she died, during my last visit. She'd held my hand and said, "I made sure it was done correctly this time." I hadn't known what she meant. I'd assumed she was talking about the medical directives. I understand now that she meant everything else. Mr. Dunmore waited until my father had finished speaking. Then he waited a moment longer, which seemed intentional. He set his reading glasses on the table and said, "There's one additional item from the estate. Your mother prepared this herself and specified it be delivered at this meeting." He slid the manila envelope to my side of the table. My mother's expression changed slightly, a small rearrangement, like furniture shifting an inch. "I wasn't aware of any additional items," my father said. "It was prepared through my office independently," Mr. Dunmore said. He said it pleasantly, without apology. I picked up the envelope. My sister finally looked up from her folder. Inside was a folded sheet of notepad paper, covered in my grandmother's handwriting, a short note, a small brass key, the kind that opens a cabinet or a lockbox, and a list of 7 numbers, catalog numbers. I recognized the format immediately, the kind used in design archives and registration filings. The note said, "Start with what I registered in my own name. The rest will follow the same thread." Below that, one more line, "I made sure you'd know what to do with this. I was right to." I didn't go back to my parents' hotel that night. I drove to the inn on the far side of town, a place my grandmother and I had stopped for coffee a dozen times over the years. The owner recognized my last name but didn't ask questions. I carried my bag upstairs, sat at the small desk by the window, and spread the note out next to my laptop. The catalog numbers were from a textile design registry. I knew the database. I'd used it professionally for years to verify provenance on historical collections. I opened it and typed in the first number. The design that came up was one I recognized immediately. A geometric weave pattern in soft ochre and gray that my grandmother had used as the foundation of her company's most licensed product. I'd seen bolts of it in her studio since childhood. I'd seen it on contract sheets in the estate documents my father had presented that afternoon, listed under a holding company's name. But the original registration, the first filing, from over 20 years ago, was under my grandmother's personal name. Not the company's, not the holding company, hers. I typed in the second number. Then the third. By the time I reached the 6th, a pattern had emerged that wasn't about design at all. Each of these original registrations had been subsequently refiled, transferred to a holding entity called Linworth Holdings. The transfer documents were signed. The dates were recent, all within the last 5 years. The signature on each transfer was not my grandmother's. It was my father's. I leaned back in the chair and let the room be quiet for a moment. I didn't feel surprise. I felt the particular sensation of a suspicion that has lived in the back of your chest for years, finally stepping forward into full light. I opened my work notebook and started a fresh page. I wrote the 7 numbers across the top and began drawing lines between the filings, original registrations, transfer dates, signatures, the holding entity's registration history. I color-coded the anomalies in red. By midnight, 3 pages were full. The picture was clear. The original intellectual property, 7 foundational textile designs that formed the backbone of my grandmother's licensing revenue, had been systematically transferred to a holding company my father controlled over a period of 5 years. The transfers were structured just below the thresholds that would trigger automatic estate review. My grandmother's name appeared nowhere on the transfer documents, but her name appeared on everything that came before them. I closed the notebook. I picked up the small brass key and held it in my hand, feeling the slight roughness of its grip. Then I thought about what she had said. I made sure it was done correctly this time. I knew which lock this key belonged to. I'd seen it 100 times. The low wooden cabinet beneath her drafting table, the one she always rested her hand on when she stood to leave the studio. I'd never thought much about the gesture. I thought about it now. I arrived at the studio before dawn. My family's cars weren't there. They were staying across town and planned to return that morning to begin cataloging the space. I had perhaps 3 hours. The carriage house was unlocked. My grandmother had given me a key years ago. I'd never returned it. Inside, the air was the same as it had always been, linen and cedar, and the faint mineral smell of dried ink. The work lamp was off. The room sat in gray early light, the bolt fabric still in its color-coded rows, the pattern books undisturbed on the shelves. I knelt in front of the drafting table and fitted the small brass key into the cabinet lock. It opened. Inside were 2 shallow drawers. The first held a set of flat binders, each labeled with a year. The second held a portable recorder, a sealed envelope with my name on the front, and a clear sleeve containing 3 printed email chains. I went through the binders first. They were registration records, originals, physical copies, all predating the transfers I'd found in the database. Beneath each original registration was a handwritten annotation in her script, noting the date she'd first drafted the design and where the original sketch could be found. Every entry was dated. Every one was hers. The email chains were between my father and a contact at Linworth Holdings. The language was careful, the way legal language is careful when it knows exactly what it's doing. But the meaning was plain. My father had identified the 7 designs as the highest revenue assets in the portfolio, assessed their standalone market value, and arranged the transfer while my grandmother was in early treatment, during a period when she had granted him temporary signature authority for routine business matters. Routine. I set the emails down and picked up the recorder. There was a single button on the side. I pressed it. My grandmother's voice came through the small speaker, steady and unhurried, exactly the way she always spoke. If you're hearing this, you found the cabinet, which means you read the note, which means you understood what I was pointing you toward. A pause, and I heard her shift in her chair, the familiar creak of the old studio stool. I want to be clear about what happened. I didn't sign those transfers. I didn't authorize them. When I discovered what had been done, I consulted Mr. Dunmore, and we prepared the documentation to correct it. The designs are mine. They always were. I've made sure the final record reflects that. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I didn't tell you more directly while I was still well. I didn't want you to carry it before it was time to carry it. You were always steadier than people gave you credit for. I was right to trust you with this. The recording ended. I sat on the studio floor for a while, not thinking about what came next. Just sitting with the sound of her voice in the quiet room, with the familiar smell of linen and cedar settling around me, with the open binders in my lap. Then I stood up, photographed every page carefully, backed the images up to 2 separate cloud folders, and placed everything back in order exactly as I'd found it. I locked the cabinet. I put the key in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to Mr. Dunmore. I found the cabinet. I think we're ready. He replied within 4 minutes. I'll be there at 9. My family arrived at 9:15. They came in together. My mother first, then my father, then my sister a step behind. They were dressed for the work of clearing an estate. Practical close, that particular combination of composed grief and logistics that follows a death in families like mine. My mother noticed Mr. Dunmore immediately, and her face went careful. "We didn't realize you'd be here this morning," she said. "Your mother asked me to be," he said. His briefcase was already open on the work table. A small projector sat connected to his laptop. My sister's eyes moved to it and stayed there. "There are some outstanding estate matters," Mr. Dunmore said. "This won't take long." My father's composure was one of his most consistent qualities. Even now it held. "Whatever it is can be addressed through the usual channels. We have a full day." "Your mother prepared for this specifically," Mr. Dunmore said. He said it the same way he said everything, without heat, without urgency, as though he were reading a weather report. "She asked that it happen here, in this room." He pressed a key on his laptop. The projector cast a rectangle of light against the wall above the pattern book shelves. My grandmother's face appeared on the wall. She was sitting at this same drafting table, looking directly into the camera. She looked thin. She looked like herself. "I'm recording this on March 4th, she said. "I'm doing this because I want there to be no confusion about what I intend and what I know. I discovered in October that 7 design registrations were transferred out of my personal name without my authorization. I have documentation of the originals and documentation of the transfers. I did not sign those transfers. I did not approve them. I am correcting the record now while I am still legally competent to do so, and I am placing the corrected record with my attorney." She looked at the camera without expression. "The designs belong to the person who drew them. They always did." My father said, "This is being taken out of context. There were conversations about restructuring the portfolio that she was part of. She may not have recalled the specifics accurately toward the end." "Dad." My sister's voice came out quietly. She was looking at the projection wall, not at him. Something in her face had gone still in a way I hadn't seen before. Not guilt, exactly, but the look of someone working rapidly through the implications of new information. Mr. Dunmore opened his briefcase and removed a file. "The estate directives were updated 6 months before your mother's death. The updated directives supersede the preliminary documents presented yesterday. The 7 foundational design registrations, along with their associated licensing revenue, have been retransferred to their original registration holder. The transfer is already complete. It is on file with the registry as of last week." He set the file on the work table. "Everything else distributed yesterday remains as stated. The business operations, the property, the company name, those transfer to your daughter as described. But the intellectual property underlying those operations belongs to Arden." My mother stepped forward. "The business can't function without those designs. What you're describing would effectively require a licensing arrangement," Mr. Dunmore said, "which Arden is under no obligation to enter into, though I imagine a reasonable negotiation would serve everyone's interests." He looked at me. "That's entirely your decision, and there's no timeline on it." The room was quiet. My father's hand rested on the work table, not gripping it, just resting, but I noticed it. I hadn't planned to say anything. I reached into my pocket and set the small brass key on the table between us. My mother's eyes went to it and away again, quickly, the way you look away from something you recognize too late. "I'm not interested in a negotiation right now," I said. "I'll be in touch when I am." My sister looked at me then, a long and careful look. She said softly, directed at no one in particular, "She left the key for you." Not a question. Just the sound of something clicking into place for her, something she'd been working through since she'd seen the envelope the day before. I didn't answer. There was nothing that needed answering. My father said, "This can be contested." He said it the way people say things they haven't fully decided to mean yet. "It can," Mr. Dunmore said. "I'd recommend consulting your own attorney first. Your mother was thorough. She had a great deal of time to be thorough." He paused. "She was always that way." No one said anything else. Not because there was agreement, but because the architecture of the argument had been removed and there was nothing left to push against. My father gathered himself the way he always did, said they would speak to their attorney, and moved toward the door. My mother picked up her bag without looking at me. My sister was the last to leave. At the doorway, she stopped. She didn't turn around, but after a moment she said, "To the room or to me or to no one. She talked about you, you know, more than you probably knew. I just never understood what she was seeing." She left, and the studio door closed, and the room settled back into its quiet. Mr. Dunmore finished packing his briefcase without ceremony. He told me the paperwork would be fully processed within the week, that my grandmother had thought of everything, that she had been. He searched for the word precise. He said it with something that wasn't quite a smile, but served the same purpose. Then he left, and the studio was mine. I stood in the center of it for a while. The morning light had shifted, moving off the north window and beginning to cross the drafting table. The bolt fabric caught it in strips. The ochre and gray of the first registered design, the deep blue of another, the pale wheat-colored linen she'd used for the sample books that were stacked along the east wall exactly as she'd left them. I walked to the drafting table and stood where she used to stand. The surface was clean. One pattern book was still open where she'd left it, the last one she'd been working in during the final months before she got too ill to come to the studio. The page was dated in her handwriting, a half-finished design in pencil, not yet inked. The lines curved and crossed in a way I recognized as distinctly hers. The slight irregularity she built into the geometry deliberately because she thought perfect symmetry looked mechanical, lifeless. I reached into my work bag and took out the silver thimble. I set it on the drafting table beside the open book. She had told me once, standing at this same spot, that the most important thing about archival work was knowing the difference between what was preserved and what was hidden. Preservation was intentional, she said. Someone chose it, kept it safe, made sure it survived. Hidden things were different. Hidden things were waiting to be found by the right person, at the right time, with the right set of eyes. I understood now that she'd been talking about herself. About what she'd built quietly, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of foresight. She had known what was happening to the designs. She had waited until she had the means and the clarity to correct it properly. And she had trusted me to be the one who completed it, because she had spent years, without either of us naming what she was doing, teaching me exactly how to do this kind of work. The studio was quiet. Outside the north window, a cardinal landed on the fence post and sat for a moment, bright against the pale November light, before lifting off into the gray sky. I pulled out the low stool from under the drafting table, her stool, worn soft along the seat from decades of use, and I sat down. I didn't open the pattern book. I didn't take notes. I just sat in the room that smelled like her work and let the quiet be what it was. Not empty, not borrowed, not something I was permitted to occupy temporarily while others decided my value. Mine at last, the way things become yours, when someone who truly saw you made sure you wouldn't have to fight to keep them.